let's say that you are Sir Arthur Sullivan, Victorian-era composer extraordinaire. It's London, it's the 1880s. You work with a man named W.S.Gilbert, and together you create incredibly popular English comic operas, which will entertain thousands and will go on to be performed for another century after you die. Gilbert writes all the song lyrics and dialogue for the operettas, and your job is to compose the accompanying music. Your joint works are famous for their wit and humor. Gilbert ruthlessly satirizes Victorian-era society by concocting topsy-turvy stories which mock ridiculous social norms, the aristocracy, the military, famous people, and current events. How do you, Sir Arthur Sullivan, musical composer extraordinaire, tackle the daunting job of using melody and harmony to enhance or complement this satirical endeavor? In a previous video, we talked about who Gilbert and Sullivan were and why their beloved operettas are still being performed today, 140 years after they were created. In this video, we're going to talk to some experts about how Arthur Sullivan used his prodigious musical skill to bring W.S. Gilbert's words to instrumental, vocal, and orchestral life. Like most great composers, Sir Arthur Sullivan began his musical education in early childhood. His father was a military bandmaster, and he learned to sing and play several musical instruments at a young age. He later studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London and the Leipzig Conservatory in Germany. His teachers exposed him to the works of Mendelssohn, Schubert, Beethoven, and numerous other famous composers, some of which lived and worked at the same time as Sullivan himself. Sullivan became capable of writing in numerous musical styles, and his early compositions frequently show the influences of other famous composers. However, Sullivan wasn't merely emulating other composers because they sounded nice. These musical references always served a purpose, and that was usually to enhance the setting or the humor of the story and characters in Gilbert's librettos.
People have called it derivative or have accused him of actually stealing things from other composers. When he used them in Gilbert and Sullivan, it was usually very deliberate, whether he was actually pulling out a specific line because he was, equating it to something in someone else's show, or just to get an overall feeling. His audiences at the time would have responded to certain musical things. Mendelssohn was very popular. Wagner has become popular. So he could pull in that style. That he did not do this in his choral works, in his non-GNS operas and some of his other stuff. So when he did use it in Gilbert and Sullivan, in his work with Gilbert, it was very deliberate.
By evoking the hallmarks of other well-known composers or whole genres of music, he could poke fun at particular character archetypes, common opera tropes, or simply create a particular mood according to whatever was necessary for the story.
And I think he can also just swallow a style. Not necessarily quoting a particular composer, but you can name a musical style. And somewhere in those operas he's using it.
And because going to see an opera was a very popular pastime in Victorian England, these references would have been noticeable to many of the people who went to see a Gilbert and Sullivan show. This is particularly evident in Sullivan's music for the comic opera Iolanthe, which involves a dispute between fairies and lords of parliament, and which premiered at the Savoy Theatre in 1882.
And of course, if a situation resembled something in an opera or another play, and so for Iolanthe, with fairies in it, of course he turned to Midsummer Night's Dream from Mendelssohn. A lot of it just has the string writing, just has a shimmering, that you hear. It reminds you of the fairies in addition to the Mendelssohn thing in Iolanthe. The Wagner was getting to be big then, and some of the fairy queen's costume looked like a Valkyrie.
But the Mendelssohn references, if you go through the whole score, are almost entirely around the fairy, the chorus of fairies. And the Wagner references are all around the fairy queen, who in the original production had a sort of Brunhilde-esque costume and was apparently a rather statuesque lady. So I think he's deliberately contrasting these two very, very different composers. Bow thy head to destiny, death thy doom, and thou shalt die. This alliteration that you find all through Wagner's librettos. So Sullivan gives it this nice full brass, it's right out of Wagner.
Bow thy head to destiny,
Sullivan also frequently used common musical genres or regional styles, particularly folk dances, to complement the setting.
The melodies very often in operetta, as opposed to opera, are dance music, because this was the popular music of the day.
He uses a lot of dance forms as basis for songs, or dances within songs.
But I think that is one of the things that traditionally you think of. This is the waltz. This is a polka. This is lots of gavottes, minuets as well in Gilbert and Sullivan, because they're dealing with period pieces in some cases. Like Gondoliers is set in 1750.
The Gondoliers premiered at the Savoy in 1889. Because it takes place in Venice, Italy, Sullivan composed several songs in the style of Italian dances, like the saltarello and the tarantella, and used musical techniques common to Italian opera.
But if you take the first, 20 minutes of Gondoliers, it's not really Donizetti, and it's not really Verdi, and it's not really Puccini even, but it's Italian. It's Italian all the way through, all sorts of writing thirds and big arching melodies and melismata, and just all sorts of Italian tricks.
Occasionally, Sullivan might even directly quote a melody from another composer.
Lines, and yeah, he did deliberately, I'm not going to say steal, he deliberately copied exact music lines in some places, and he would start off for a couple of measures and then go off into his own thing. But as I said, I think he did that very deliberately and knowingly, whether it was to get a rise out of his audience or just an acknowledgement, to these other composers.
He used this to great effect in Ruddigore, which premiered in 1887, by briefly quoting Mozart's Don Giovanni, one of the most popular operas of all time, and one that many in Gilbert and Sullivan's audience would have been familiar with. Creating a musical association between the two enhances Gilbert's topsy-turvy story. In Mozart's opera, Don Giovanni is an unrepentant womanizer who kills the father of a woman he's attempting to seduce.
At the end of the first scene in Don Giovanni, the title character kills Donna Anna's father, the commendatore, and at the moment he perishes, Mozart gives us this extraordinary chromatic descending scale.
The spirit of the slain father later returns in the form of an animated statue to drag Don Giovanni to hell as punishment for his various crimes. In Ruddigore, however, during a very similar scene, this dynamic is turned totally upside down. Here, the ghost of the Baronet Roderick Murgatroyd comes out of his portrait painting to punish his nephew Riven Murgatroyd for not committing enough crimes, because their family line is under a curse. Riven, a goody-goody up until this point, only agrees to do something acceptably horrible under pain of torture from Roderick and the other ghostly ancestors of his family, after which the ghosts all step back into their picture frames.
In the Ruddigore ghost scene, steps unwillingly once more. Exact same rhythm, exact same melody, at the exact same moment of not a death, but going back into their inanimate state inside the picture frames. Right after the ghosts step unwillingly once more into their picture frames, the music becomes silent for a second, and then it explodes with the full brass and tutti orchestra with and then which with the tonality and the orchestration, it sounds a lot like the moment that the commendatore bursts on the scene.
While the GNS operettas may contain multiple examples of Sullivan using exact quotations from other composers for some humorous effect, they are always brief, usually only lasting a few bars before becoming something different, having served the purpose of creating a mental association for the audience.
But that was just a beginning. It wasn't the whole thing. You know, he took it, an idea there, and then made it his own and made it seem like his own.
He always, always speaks with his own voice. He sings his own song. Even if he's making a jab in the ribs at somebody else. It's a Sullivan song. And he's capable of moments of sublime beauty.
Sullivan's careful use of varied operatic styles for his work with W.S.Gilbert had a more far-reaching effect than just aiding the stories they were telling. The world of musical entertainment in late Victorian England, much like Victorian society at large, was highly stratified. There was the highbrow, refined world of grand opera, symphonies, and religious music, enjoyed by the upper classes, often in a foreign language like Italian or French, and the lowbrow world of operetta, burlesques, and music hall shows, performed in English and far less formal. Neither the actors nor the middle and working class audiences took this type of entertainment very seriously.
So here's something that I think a lot of people don't understand about the time period for both Gilbert and Sullivan. This is no longer the era of sponsorships. So you could go for the really serious stuff and hope to become famous. And if you were independently wealthy or married right, you could get away with that. If you actually needed to make a living during the second half of the 19th century, that was music hall. The more serious musicians didn't think much of what Sullivan was doing because he sold out. And I have read some interviews with him where he's like, yeah, if someone would publish me, I would write it. I mean, I think that was part of the reason that Gilbert and Sullivan were looked down on, at least initially, because they did come out of this more lowbrow music hall. I mean, Gilbert initially was very deliberately parodying burlesques and things like that.
Because that was a much more popular entertainment. And they would literally play grand opera music just with a cheap band and non-opera singers. They would just do it as a joke.
Gilbert and Sullivan pioneered a style of English operetta that straddled these two worlds. Because it wasn't in a foreign language, it was accessible to wider audiences, while the truly beautiful music combined with Gilbert's brilliantly written satire elevated their work above supposedly lower forms of entertainment.
So I think their audiences changed, especially after D'Oyly Carte built a whole theater for them, and they started to become their own thing. So they weren't opera, they weren't that high class, but they definitely weren't the music hall.
That's another reason, especially in the earlier works, he's quoting serious, or imitating serious, pompous music, because it does add an air of respectability. And that, this is proper music, it's not just oompa oompa, this is a real composer at work, take this seriously, or at least respect what I've done.
But yeah, they achieved a sort of popularity that had been unheard of before that.
Their combined work was so enduringly popular partly because it carved out an entirely new niche of musical entertainment for the masses, which would cement the longevity of the GNS operettas for more than a century. And without Sir Arthur Sullivan's tremendous musical skill and creativity, none of it would have been possible.
It's just immediately accessible, but it also pays back repeated listenings. And there's something about it. It's just incredibly melodic, catchy, rhythmic, And then Gilbert's words, I mean, I think Gilbert and Sullivan is not particularly well known outside of English-speaking countries because they don't have easy access to Gilbert's words, and it doesn't work. You lose it all in translation. But Sullivan's music is so tied up to it, that for English-speaking audiences, even if they don't know it, I think there's just a lot to enjoy. And you think of the words, and the music comes to mind. You think of the music, and the words come to mind. Laughter and music is an unbeatable combination. I think people, when they go out after seeing a Gilbert and Sullivan show, have something to hum on the way home and amusing thing to talk about with their companion on the way home too.
Rapid, unintelligible pattern isn't generally heard, but it is, it doesn't matter. This particular rapid, unintelligible